with remote work obviously being forced on us by the pandemic. Now there's this slow return. You've got hybrid work, I think, is here to stay. You got some CEOs, Jamie Dimon, he's public, he's tracking people's key fobs. They're tracking people's keystrokes. I've reported on crazy stories where people are being spied on in remote work, all the things that's out there. And there's this tension right now between leaders and workers. How does a leader look at what you do and everything we've been discussing, relationship, happiness, well-being, how they need to be looking at those factors alongside of how we're going to work? Are we remote? Are we hybrid? Are we all back in? I'm just curious your take on how work is being shaped and what maybe the future might look like and the challenge for leaders.
For those who have remote capable work, and again, that's a big emphasis because as we look at the world's global workplace, many, of course, don't have that particular opportunity. Mm-hmm. But for those that do have hybrid ready work or available, the future of work for them is hybrid. And you can see very clearly in the data, the United States here with their time use survey, that those that are engaging in hybrid work, they're avoiding the thing that makes them most miserable in the day, which is the commute. In fact, if you ask workers, which we did, and said, what is it that you hate the most about your single day at work? They say it's the commute. It's about 40% of them say that's what I want to avoid the most. And in that time use survey that the US government did, is what they found is that people are making better use of that time. They're spending more time socializing, they're spending more time sleeping, working out, and on their hobbies. So it is an overall boost to their life. But even though makes their life better from those respects, there is a risk that it makes their work life worse.
Yes.
And here's the reason why. So we have been studying those that have been working remotely full time. And although their engagement is higher in absolute terms, over the past 2 years, they've seen the biggest decline in engagement. And the reason for that, and again, I consider engagement and work well-being to be the concepts that are identical. In fact, Danny Kahneman said something very similar on Adam Grant's podcast. And so the reason I think that their work well-being is in decline is because of a lack of communication. Microsoft did this one study, which I thought was really interesting, where they said those that are working remotely are engaging in far more asynchronous communication. And when we engage in more asynchronous communication, we start to understand each other far less. And that's a problem. And so if the future of work is going to be hybrid, leaders need to think far more critically about how do I engage in better, more synchronous dialogue with those that I'm working with? Because right now, the things that they're suffering from is feeling less recognized, feeling less like they have developmental opportunities, and feeling less like they know what's expected of them at work. All three things that have one thing in common: good communication. And so that's where leaders need to evolve as fast as possible if hybrid is going to be the future for those that are remote ready.
Yeah, that leads me to, you talk about loneliness in this book. And I feel like that's a nice little transition here, because loneliness exists certainly when you're in a remote setting, but also in the hallways. Give us your thoughts on loneliness and then the leader's response to it.
I think that loneliness is one of the most underappreciated problems facing our world today.
I agree.
And the reason I say that is we went out and asked people, look at the past 2 weeks and tell us, how many people did you spend time with? Friends, family, anyone? And so in the responses, we had people say 150. I spent time with 90. I mean, they were very popular people that we engaged with. Sometimes people would say 7, but then there was a group of people who said 0.
Wow.
I didn't engage with anyone. In fact, that one engagement was our phone call or us knocking on the door and engaging in that dialogue with them. We find that 6% of all adults globally, or 300 million people around the planet, don't have a single friend that they talk to in their life.
Wow.
And it's no longer an exaggeration to say that loneliness kills. There is an academic at BYU, Julianne Luntz-Holt, where she did a meta-analysis on loneliness, And she found that those who suffer from debilitating loneliness have an increased risk of dying by 50%, 50%, of anything. And the reason is not just that you don't have anyone to talk to. So if you're stressed out, you can kind of have a friend that'll be there for you to listen to. The other thing is you don't have anyone that's looking out for you. There was a study that was done, or excuse me, it wasn't a study, it was a real case. Authorities in Italy were knocking on houses to warn people about high winds. And they kept knocking repeatedly on this woman's door, and nobody had heard from her. So they went into her house and they'd find that she had passed away. But that wasn't the worst part, is that she had been dead for 2 years and no one knew. But there are 300 million people on the planet that live just like her. And it's not just the amount of friends that we have, it's also the quality. So we ask people globally, if things go really bad in your life, do you have anyone there that would help you out? We find that 20% of adults everywhere say no to that particular question.
Oh my goodness.
And so there are some governments that are taking this very seriously. Japan twice has had ministries of loneliness. There is the Joe Cox Commission that's in the UK, where they too have started to, it's not technically a ministry of loneliness, but they're taking it that seriously, especially for the elderly population. So this is a big issue that not just public sector leaders should be more focused on, but also the private sector, because we know in studying workplaces everywhere that workplace relationships are a good thing. They're not just a good thing for productivity. They're not just a good thing for reducing turnover. They're also a good thing for reducing global loneliness. So private sector leaders have a massive role that they can play in this dialogue.
Yeah. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, John. You may have seen it, but there's been some recent news reports with some surveys. And again, I wish I could pull the exact number. I'm talking to the chief pollster of all time here. But we're seeing a rising number of people who don't want to socialize at all with their coworkers. I'm sure you've seen these reports. They're like, hey, I want to leave work at work. I don't want to hang out. I don't want to do any work activities, not work related, but just I don't want to hang out with my coworkers after hours, the happy hour, not interested. I don't want to talk to them at the office. I don't want to know about their kids. And we're seeing a rise in those numbers where they reject this idea. So that's obviously juxtaposed to what you just said and the value of workplace relationships. Is that rise a result of they're in a crappy environment, back to what we've kind of been talking about? And so that environment is so miserable that they want to leave it and leave it completely be.
You know, one thing that leaders have to keep in mind in terms of there's so many with good hearts, and they say, you know what, we know this is something that private sector leaders can work on, so let's try to encourage friendships. And then they do something that's just not great, which is they force it. One of my favorite articles, this was by the columnist Bartleby in The Economist. I think it's right now a woman that wrote this particular piece, and she said one of the places where we can draw inspiration is the Beatles. Because the Beatles formed bonds with each other, not because they did axe throwing activities after work. It's because they jammed constantly and they loved what they did. And those bonds formed naturally. And so what they would do is not necessarily just write music together and play together. They would also play and get inspiration from other people's music. So they would just try out a song that somebody else had done. And that constant jamming, her words, is what caused them to have these very strong bonds. And that's one of the things that workplaces can draw an inspiration from, is to say, look, rather than force this, let's remember that we're all here for a common purpose. People join organizations for the brand and the mission that they're trying to accomplish. So let them happen naturally, and encourage them when they're doing it, but don't ever force it. And if there's those people that say, look, I don't want to have those workplace relationships. Don't add me on Facebook. Don't add me on Instagram. Fine. Let it happen. It's okay. Because forcing it just makes it completely awkward.
Yeah.